Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad, and we are live again from the University of Richmond's Robbins School of Business. What, pray tell, did Virginia just tell us? 12 months after Joe Biden won the once reliably red state by 10 points, newcomer Glenn Youngkin took Richmond back for the GOP, the party's first statewide win since 2009. No shortage of national hot takes on the implications for the midterms, Election 2024, and the path ahead for the two parties. My guests are two seasoned watchers of Virginia politics, Pope and Schapiro, who you hear every Friday morning on Virginia Public Radio. Tonight, they're live on stage. Stay with us. This special taping is made possible by our host, the University of Richmond's Robbins School of Business, preparing students to be future leaders in a global business world. The Robbins School, where real-world teaching, scholarship, and service are at the forefront of the curriculum. More at robbins.richmond.edu. And by Salomon & Ludwin, a boutique wealth management firm dedicated to helping families make smart financial decisions. Recognized by Barron's as a Hall of Fame advisor. More at salomonludwin.com. Full Disclosure Podcast to NPR One, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts at link fulldradio.com. Joining me on stage at the University of Richmond's Robbins School, the duo of Schapiro and Pope. Jeff Schapiro, veteran politics columnist for the Richmond Times-Dispatch. He's been in the RVA since 1979. And Michael Pope, his battery mate of Virginia Public Radio. He's reported for NPR, the New York Daily News, and you can often catch his analysis on CBSN streaming. Hear them both Friday mornings on VPR. Welcome.
It's great to be here.
Thank you for having us.
I got to jump in. No shortage of attention for this election. We didn't, is it an upset?
Certainly an upset in that it upset the conventional wisdom. Virginia has been bluing. I think the shade of blue is important. It's probably closer to Carolina blue than Michigan blue. But we nonetheless saw a Republican win by 2 points and change a year after Joe Biden won the state by 10 percentage points. Not to take anything away from Mr. Youngkin and his victory. Cost him a lot of money, $20 million of his personal fortune, but there's more where that came from. But maybe as the evening progresses, we can talk about how, and Michael and I have discussed this off and on over the campaign. In Virginia, there's an election every year, and every election has a different electorate.
Yeah, I want you, for our listeners, to explain the peculiarity of this election, because tremendous amount of eyeballs on it, and that it's the first referendum on the Biden presidency, or on Reagan elected in 1980 or Reagan in 1984. You could look at Bush in 88. Virginia seems to be the first place nationally that the opposition party can kind of put its hooks into.
Yeah, so Virginia actually has this really interesting timing where the race for governor directly follows the race for president. And there's a long history of Virginia acting as a counterpoint to what happens in the presidential election, dating all the way back to the late 70s. After the election of Jimmy Carter, Virginia gave us John Dalton. And then when in the Reagan Revolution, Virginia gave us Chuck Robb. And then when G.W. Bush was elected, Virginia gave us Douglas Wilder. And then when Bill Clinton was elected, Virginia gave us George Allen. And then when W. Bush was elected, Virginia gave us Mark Warner. And then when Obama was elected, Virginia gave us Bob McDonnell. So there's actually a really long history of Virginia acting as a counterpoint. And that's a sort of a magnetic force that's, worth remembering. Jeff Schapiro started by saying it was an upset to conventional wisdom. One piece of conventional wisdom we can probably throw in the garbage can is this idea that high turnout elections benefit Democrats and low turnout elections benefit Republicans, because this was a huge turnout for a gubernatorial election, 55%, way higher than any of the other recent elections. And Democrats increased their turnout. They had really good numbers compared to the last election for governor and the election for governor before that. It's just that the Republicans severely increased their turnout and won in a high turnout election. So you say an upset for conventional wisdom. That was the biggest upset for conventional wisdom, I think.
Just a footnote to Michael's point. I think that to some degree, the higher turnout, 55%, the highest in an election for governor since George Allen's victory in 1993, that was a 50% turnout. The Democrats did well. They didn't do as well as they had to with their preferred mix of voters. Also, this pattern in which the party that wins the presidency one year loses the governorship the next, that we call that the Virginia curse.
And it was restored.
It was restored, but it was disrupted once. And Michael didn't mention that.
I didn't mention that. Well, I was looking at when new presidents are elected. So, I mean, you can look at all the presidential elections, and then the re-election of Barack Obama is the outlier when Terry McAuliffe was elected. But that was a re-election. So, I mean, if you look at just the election of new presidents, the pattern still holds.
But for background on this, as I saw, before Obama in 2008, the last time the state elected a Democrat was LBJ in 1964. I mean, even in the Carter, Southern retake and everything, Virginia stayed out. It opted out. It voted for Bush twice.
And the counterpoint to that wasn't it Mills Godwin, the Democrat turned Republican, who was the only other person other than McAuliffe to try to come back?
And the reason I think Mills Godwin won, running that second time as a Republican, was because Virginia reverted to form. It voted what it was, which was a center-right state against a significant challenge in the form of Henry Howell, the great fire-breathing populist, but also in the face of headwinds from Watergate, Richard Nixon, fuel prices, an issue we've heard a good deal about in this campaign, a balky economy, certainly an uneven economy. There were similar problems for Terry McAuliffe, hostility for Joe Biden, disappointment even in a state he carried with his performance, the inaction of Congress on the various infrastructure initiatives. And then I think it's easy to fault the loser, but I think to some degree one must underscore that Terry McAuliffe, God love him, there's this innate inner carnival barker in him, and he has a way of getting in the way of his message, that he's high decibel, eyes bulging, sweaty and animated.
But here's my question is, hold on, Ralph Northam, he's kind of a footnote here. He was hardly mentioned this election because the other conventional wisdom might have said that to a certain degree he was a lame duck as recently as February of 2019 when he was discovered in this yearbook scandal, and many elders in the party are calling for him to step down. There's a whole parallel scandal with his lieutenant governor. Not only did he stick around, but the state legislature turned. He could stump on voting rights and gun rights and marijuana legalization to a certain degree. What's peculiar is the incumbent party couldn't exactly run on that. I'm not sure, Michael, that he was necessarily radioactive. They did embrace one another to a certain extent, but it's not like Terry McAuliffe could come out and say, why would you not want a continuation of these popular policies? There had to be a kind of a demarcation. It was seemingly all about connecting Trump to Youngkin.
Well, so if you think about the series of scandals there and the era of blackface, Northam is not running again. Justin Fairfax lost in the primary. Mark Herring lost in the general. So, I mean, the two out of the three that were on the ballot both lost. So there's that. And, in terms of sort of running on the record of things that they did in office, I actually do think McAuliffe tried to do that. Every now and then you would hear him talk about his record and things that he did when he was governor. That's not the message that pierced through to voters, though. I think if you think about reactions that people had to the Terry McAuliffe campaign, it does seem like it was kind of all about Trump all the time. And any messaging that he might have had around, paid family sick leave or hazard pay or raising the minimum wage, that was all obscured by Trump all the time, which, as it turns out, was not a good tactic.
Well, I don't know that the Trump-Youngkin axis is something that people should dismiss. To Youngkin's credit, he packaged himself well. He came across, in large part because of a summer of largely unanswered biographical television ads, as the hoop-playing next-door neighbor who loved his mongrel dogs. He seemed approachable.
But he's a private equity
mongrel
guru.
dogs?
I mean,
Well, and we need to talk about that. And I think one of the messages from the campaign to which maybe Michael was beginning to allude, and by bringing up Northam, I think you did, and that is with this great swing over several years, starting with Northam's election, all of this a response, a reaction to Trump, that Virginia, a state that tends to be more practical in its outlook, even as it pivots slightly to the left, I think there was this sense, certainly among Republicans, that Virginia had gone too far.
Yeah,
and one of the things we never saw from Ralph Northam, and I think I wonder if we'll see this from rookie virgin governor Glenn Youngkin. Will they or will he serve as a check on the excesses or the potential excesses of his party?
Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad. We are live at the University of Richmond's Robin School of Business, talking with my esteemed guests, Schapiro and Pope, the duo of Jeff Schapiro and Michael Pope. You can hear them every Friday morning on Virginia Public Radio and Radio IQ. We're talking about the Republicans' big night, the November 2021 election. I got to ask you, which invisible hand, I don't know which party elder succeeded in keeping Trump physically away from the state and away from proximity to candidate Youngkin? I mean, I know that he's been shorn of Twitter for several months, Trump, and he only kind of injected himself into it afterwards and saying he wouldn't have won without my tacit endorsement. But who behind the scenes did that? Because I was led to believe that the party's still enthralled to candidate in waiting Donald Trump.
There are a couple of people who were involved in keeping Trump in his cage, if you will. There was John Fredericks, who is sort of the face and voice of Trump Republicanism here in Virginia, broadcaster. Jeff Rowe, who was the principal campaign consultant to Youngkin, is a Ted Cruz guy, and through that relationship has access to that chap in exile.
But what did they exert moral suasion or something behind the scenes? How do you even do that? Like, hang low, you want to see how this goes, and you can come out closer to the midterms? How does that even work?
But what was missing, and which was potentially lethal, was the visual component. At no point did one see Glenn Youngkin sharing the same stage as Donald Trump. When Trump did pronounce Youngkin to be worthy, and he did so more than a half a dozen times, it was either by written statement, it was in an interview with John Fredericks on his morning radio program, at one point phoning into a rally here in Henrico, suburban Richmond, while Youngkin was 122 miles away in Forest, Virginia. And then even on the eve of the election, there was another Trump splash. It was done in such a way that Trump was at a safe distance beyond the borders of our Commonwealth, and Youngkin was outside of the blast zone.
Michael, I want to read from The Economist magazine, this recent issue after the election, 1 year on, which shows Joe Biden falling into this abyss. The Lexington column, and by the way, Jeff Schapiro has, for 30 years, I'm told, penned the occasional piece for The Economist magazine. I've recognized your voice and your flair, and it's not byline. So I was struck by this. Lexington column said, Glenn Youngkin and Ivy League populism. Virginia's governor-elect is the latest Republican culture warrior with an expensive education. A visitor from Mars might find Youngkin's populist scare tactics at odds with his record of elite institutions. Harvard, McKinsey, the Carlyle Group, and immense wealth. The Martian should then be challenged to find an up-and-coming Republican with a much humbler resume. Populist leaders from Perón to Orban are more often elite figures than working-class heroes. And so it is in the Republican Party. The anti-elitism fervor that has captured the right is largely a creation of rich Ivy Leaguers.
Rich people involved in politics is nothing new, right? In fact, if we think about the template for a wealthy guy becoming governor of Virginia with a lot of government experience, we have several examples, some of which are recent, some of which go back some time. So I think Jeff Shapiro said on the radio recently, to find the last governor with so little experience in government, you have to go all the way back to Terry McAuliffe, who had never been elected to anything, although he had been chairman of the Democratic Party and knew a lot of players in Washington. Before that, you have to go back to another wealthy guy, Mark Warner, who had been chairman of the Virginia Democratic Party and knew lots of the key players. So Youngkin is a little different because he wasn't party chairman and doesn't have those kind of relationships that McAuliffe and Warner had. In fact, to find a template, I think, for Youngkin and his lack of experience with government, you have to go all the way back to a governor from the early 1900s. I'm going to admit to stealing this from Jeff Shapiro. He tipped me off to Westmoreland Davis. You recall this conversation, Jeff Shapiro?
Yes, and Westmoreland Davis was elected in 1917. There was a
wealthy lawyer,
financier.
He owned like a horse farm in Loudoun,
and the story was that he was, born at sea, which apparently he was not, but nonetheless, lent to the public's curiosity about him. He was, until Ralph Northam was elected in 2017, the only graduate of the Virginia military alumnus. He was not a graduate, alumnus of the Virginia Military Institute.
And the reaction there was to the 1916 election, which was Woodrow Wilson. So this is actually yet another Virginia counterpoint.
Woodrow Wilson was from Stanton, though.
Yeah. Well, it is. So if you think about Woodrow Wilson, so Westmoreland Davis was a wet, and he was, not for prohibition. I mean, the politics of that era, very different. But it was a Virginia counterpoint for that era.
Jeff, what is the appeal? I got it. I've covered Carlyle in the past. This is not some middling, buyout shop. This is as bulge bracket as it gets for private equity. Global, acquisitive, in the very same, Romney mold and Bain Capital, which didn't work in 2012. How did he conceal that so well? And I understand that he won more than a dozen counties with more than 80% of the vote, that he did really well in rural Virginia.
I think there's several things going on here. First of all, this notion of, that somehow, rich guys as governor, this is very much a part of Virginia's culture. We've had sharply, profoundly patriarchal, paternalistic politics in the state. And, well-heeled white guys sitting at, the top of the pyramid, that's always been cool with Virginians. Certainly as long as the right people, if you will, were deciding who was going to occupy the governor's chair. And that was, often white people of, some substance. Remember, we had a poll tax. And literacy tests that, virtually erased blacks from the voting rolls, but poor whites as well. Government and politics, these were the activities of a certain slice of white Virginia. But to your question about Carlyle, this guy did not leave Carlyle under the best conditions. The financial press, Bloomberg, your former shop, has reported, as has the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal as well, that the co-CEO arrangement that Carlyle had did not work out for Mr. Youngkin, that his partner CEO was far more aggressive. And there was evidence, just look at the returns and Wall Street's response to them, that Carlyle wasn't doing as well as some of its competitors.
And it seems like in that analysis, he was kind of rudderless. I kind of want to go into public service. And he rode this wave, and as a first-time candidate won.
You covered finance.
Yeah.
You covered Wall Street. And you probably know better than I could ever, as a political reporter, that if there's bad news in a publicly traded company in the front office and it means getting rid of somebody, it's done so with great delicacy, lest it send the wrong signal to the markets. And so I think there's some of that behind Youngkin's departure.
So explain for me, he won by 2 points, right? Effectively a 12-point turnaround from Biden's 10-point margin of victory. Where was that? What surprised you kind of in those returns? And we're going to depart from this, but I mean, you are based in Alexandria. It's a whole different state, Northern Virginia, the Republic of Northern Virginia. Richmond is very different. The monuments came down last year. Charlottesville is different. You can't compare us to Bristol and other parts, or Tobaccoville or Farmville. What showed up much more and prevailed and determined this election for him?
Well, so a couple things to that. One would be, the surprising part to me was this huge turnout in rural areas. I mean, if you think about, McAuliffe improved on the performance of Northam. And so it did exactly what Northam did and better, and he still lost because Youngkin really, the turnout in those rural areas was huge. There were also swings in urban areas. Like I live in the People's Republic of Old Town Alexandria, and we actually do have some Republicans there. They're my neighbors and my friends. And I tell you that if you talk to Republicans who had Youngkin signs in their front lawns, you didn't see a lot of McAuliffe signs. You saw a lot. Signs don't vote, people. I mean, this is, sometimes people's head explodes when you start talking about yard signs, but there were a lot of Youngkin yard signs out there. And if you talk to Republicans who are my neighbors, they were reacting to what they saw as very drastic change in recent years. Virginia got rid of the death penalty, legalized marijuana, made it so that police officers couldn't pull you over for certain things. It got rid of abortion restrictions. It got rid of it made guns more difficult to get. It made voting easier. I mean, this is a lot of really drastic change that happened in a very short period of time. And a lot of conservative people, a lot of moderate people felt like that was really extreme and were reacting to it. And this is where we get back to the counterpoint thing I was talking about earlier. I really do think this election is kind of a counterpoint to all this drastic change that Virginia has seen in the last few years.
I don't think we can underestimate the importance of change within Virginia's population and its electorate. Virginia is, no longer this brigadoon, that is sort of, surrounded by this mist, and it just sort of goes off in its own way because, it's Virginia. Virginia is of the nation now. The majority of people who live in this state moved here from someplace else. And they've brought different voting practices, different political traditions. The majority, 2/3 of the people who live in this state live in metropolitan areas, most of them along Interstates 95 and 64. And Virginia is actually a multi-hued place. 42% of Virginians are non-white. This is made for a far more cosmopolitan, far more sophisticated electorate. What it also means is that in a lifetime, the voting strength of this state has shifted from the countryside to the cities and suburbs. In 1945, when Bill Tuck was elected governor, product of very much a rural figure, 2/3 of the votes cast in Virginia came out of the countryside. Fast forward to 2021. 2/3 of the votes are coming out of roughly a dozen or so, and I'm somewhat liberal in my description, cities and counties with populations of 200,000 to north of 1 million.
I would say the results of this election actually also prove the opposite of what you're saying, which is that, so you're saying that since the days of Bill Tuck, when sort of the rural vote was the predominant thing and not, the predominant factor in politics, not the urban areas, that now it's the urban areas because of the numbers and the demographics. And that's all true. But this election shows us the political power of the rural areas. If they mobilize in a way that they had not before, they can win a statewide election. They can win not only one statewide election, but 3 of them, right? So the opposite is also true. This election does prove the political potency of rural Virginia,
if mobilized, and
which they were in 2020.
And that was one of the targets that the Youngkin campaign established was to push election day turnout. Republicans tend to be averse to voting early, we're told. Push election day turnout to over 2 million, with hopes of harvesting most of those votes and using those election day votes to blunt, if not overtake, the 1.2 million early votes, largely Democratic votes, that were cast for 45 days ahead of the election.
Full disclosure, stay with us. Full Disclosure podcast to NPR One, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts at link fulldradio.com. Please subscribe, rate us, and recommend the show to friends and family. If you're just joining us, I'm on stage with Jeff Schapiro and Michael Pope, the duo of Schapiro and Pope that you will hear every Friday morning across much of the state of Virginia over Virginia Public Radio and Radio IQ. Jeff Schapiro is a veteran columnist with the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Michael Pope of Virginia Public Radio has penned all sorts of stories and books for the New York Daily News. You can see him on CBS. I got to ask you, Abigail Spanberger, the congresswoman, was quoted in the New York Times very famously a few days ago, and she was a pivotal, turning point for the Democratic Party in the 2018 blue wave. I believe we are in her district right here, the Virginia 7th. I don't know how the University of Richmond cuts across that line, but she said kind of in her, morning after her postmortem diagnosis of this is Joe Biden was not elected as FDR. But then you kind of feel for Joe Biden and that you realize you have a very tenuous asterisk majority in the Senate and the House, and you want to cram through as much in the way of deliverables as possible before you very likely lose both in 2022.
So you mentioned Abigail Spanberger. If you think about the election results and what they mean looking ahead, of course, next year is the congressional elections. Kevin McCarthy recently said that if you are a Democrat who's in a district that Biden won by, was it 17 points, I think, that you're in danger, basically. So that's only two members of Congress for Virginia, Elaine Luria and Abigail Spanberger. So one of the key things about this election is it tells to you, it shows that Luria and Spanberger are going to have a big target sign on their backs, moving into this election cycle. Another really important thing about the timing of having the odd year election is that all of the analysis that we're doing right now and the discussion of the election all happens in the environment when people make decisions about whether or not they want to run for re-election. And in a difficult election cycle, in a difficult district, members of Congress, not just Virginia, all over the country, might be saying to themselves, is this something that I really want to do? Or am I just going to throw in the towel? So you might have a lot of incumbents saying they don't want to run for re-election, and also candidate recruitment. Parties have to recruit candidates. And in this environment, when it looks like the wind is at the backs of Republicans, they will be able to recruit better candidates, and Democrats are going to struggle with candidate recruitment.
Hold on, but am I assuming here that Trump manages to stay out of it until after November 2022, when he could potentially take credit for this?
Let me just bring this back to Virginia for a moment. There's another wild card here, and that's redistricting. We don't know what the boundaries will be for congressional districts, for state legislative districts, House of Delegates, and the state Senate. Abigail Spanberger represents a district of 10 counties anchored by fairly blue Henrico, sometimes bluing Chesterfield, and a lot of red countryside.
Hanover County.
Actually, Hanover County was moved into the 4th district, as I recall, when these districts were redistricted by a federal court. So let's see what the boundaries bring. There are several announced candidates for the 7th district. There are several announced candidates for the 2nd district, the Elaine Luria seat in Southampton Roads. What's it going to look like? So
this is assuming we ever get new maps, right? I mean,
right,
this is the craziest process we've ever seen.
It's a cluster, and it's now in the hands of the Virginia Supreme Court, which under this constitutional amendment that was overwhelmingly approved in 2020 by Virginians who were eager to see redistricting depoliticized, if that's possible. It turns out that it was even more political than people could possibly anticipate.
It was hyper-politicized.
And it now has been tossed to 7 justices of the Virginia Supreme Court, all of whom at one point or another were approved, elected, confirmed by a Republican legislature, which has the Democrats sort of nervous.
Writ large, and this has been covered increasingly, the Democrats have a real structural problem on their hands, as you see, in that these states, you often see that stat of if you could pull 50 million, 35 million people out of California and populate them across 5 or 6 red states, you could equilibrate the results more. But the Electoral College is the Electoral College, and the Senate kind of cleaves with that. Does this kind of put that into sharp relief? I mean, Michael, you and I were discussing historic Electoral College returns. I looked at the 96 map, and I'm shocked that Clinton obviously took Arkansas, but other states in the South that, where he still had cred, I believe Missouri used to occasionally go Democratic. That's kind of just unthinkable right now.
Yeah, you have to remember that when Obama won Virginia, I think the last Democrat that won the electoral votes was Lyndon Johnson. Okay, so that's going back a long time, right? So Lyndon Johnson, all Republican, and then Obama, right? So there was
before that
was Truman.
Yeah,
by plurality.
So long history of being a red state, and then it's Obama, and so people were talking about Virginia being a purple state. I think in the era of Trump, Democrats came to believe that Virginia was a blue state and this was the new state of things. And this election tells us Virginia being a blue state is not the new state of things. That's not where we're at.
What about Joe Biden? He's been written off before. It's ancient history now. In the early days of the pandemic, the 2020 primary where he was left for dead in South Carolina and running the table resurrected his candidacy.
And now we have the infrastructure bill right after the election.
Infrastructure bill. I mean, they seem to have
timing is not great. Don't you think McAuliffe is sort of cursing under his breath and perhaps over his breath about the timing of the infrastructure
But truly,
bill?
do you think it would come down to deliverables? Had they delivered this a month ago, would it have sated enough of the Virginia populace that they would have put McAuliffe over the top?
On election night.
It might have done more to invigorate Democratic voters, or if you will, more Democratic voters, and create that preferred mix that eluded the Democrats on Election Day. I've often thought that had that bipartisan infrastructure bill gone through in early October, the second week of October, that what we would be seeing ads, McAuliffe standing alongside a dilapidated bridge saying, okay, this is what we're going to do on my watch because of this state's partnership with Washington. It might be a road. It might be a school. It could be an airport.
But the McAuliffe-Spanberger dissonance, you're having him saying, throw me a bone, give me some deliverables. And she's saying, you were not elected to be FDR. You were elected to stop chaos, i.e., the Trump presidency.
But we're talking about a representative of a district that has vast chunks of red territory versus someone who's standing at large.
The state has vast chunks of red territory that came out that he didn't feel, when he stopped the streak and was elected. Was it in 2013?
So on election night, I was at the McAuliffe, not the victory party, but I guess the loser party, the anti-victory party, the wake, the McAuliffe wake, which was in Tyson's Corner. And I ran into Congressman Conley and I pressed him on this issue. Is Congress responsible for this loss? And he was adamant, no, Congress is not responsible for this loss because in Congressman Conley's mind, there was no voter who said to themselves, well, I'm going to vote for Youngkin because Congress hasn't delivered. That's the analysis of the way things actually happened to transpire, which is that nothing happened until after the election. There is a counterfactual which Jeff Schapiro just laid out, which I think is worth thinking about. So the Senate passed this infrastructure back in August, I think it was, right? So what if the House had passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill in August or in September?
And which Glenn Youngkin endorsed.
And then the Democrats would run on making your life better and improving this bridge and bringing bus rapid transit to this transportation corridor. And there is a counterfactual to think about where Biden looked a little bit more like FDR in delivering some stuff before the election, and the Democrats were able to run on that and capitalize on that. So, Congressman Connolly was adamant. This is not Congress's fault, but he was also looking at the facts as they were at that moment. There's a counterfactual worth thinking about where the Democrats got their act together and actually did pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill in August or September, and the environment was different, and we could have had a different outcome that we're talking about.
And I don't think we can have this conversation without getting into some of the more uncomfortable elements of this campaign.
Please, your ears were burning. I was about to ask you about it.
And cultural.
Critical race theory, which was the boogeyman, which was brought up, which is not even taught in Virginia public schools, but was an amorphous.
It has become a shorthand, certainly for
like Law and Order?
And it is laden with all sorts of troubling features.
Can you unpack that for me?
Let's put it this way. If Terry McAuliffe had some difficulty with his own vote, i.e. the suburban vote, I think it was rooted in this larger notion of the disruptive effects of the pandemic, in particular, the educational experiences of children or the lack thereof, and the fear of parents that as kids were returning to school, that the Rona could disrupt things again. So I think I think that was a factor in terms of suburban votes for Youngkin. But I think as well, and perhaps these are more important issues, this idea that somehow education was becoming a form of indoctrination, that was particularly troubling. And a lot of this is a consequence of what was going on with that new Democratic majority in Richmond. One of the things that local schools were responsible for doing by mandate from the legislature was coming up with programs and systems to accommodate transgender students. This became a yowling point in the suburbs. And conveniently, one of those suburbs was just across the river from Washington, D.C., and the National Bureau of Fox News. So you had this complementary relationship between angry parents worried about critical race theory, wondering about how trans kids were going to be handled, certainly in regard to their own children, and Youngkin and Fox and the Washington Times and the Washington Examiner, these right-of-center news operations, just kind of in a continuous loop, pumping out this narrative. It was hugely successful, but it was somewhat successful largely because of an incredible boner by Terry McAuliffe in the second debate. He was asked a question about two bills he vetoed as governor, one in 2016, another in 2017, that certainly in effect seemed to deny parents a direct say in the educations of their children. And these bills in particular dealt with what kinds of books kids were reading. McAuliffe said, and this is an approximation, that he didn't think parents should have a role in the educations of their children. The next morning, that troubling remark, which initially was dismissed by the McAuliffe campaign, was the heart of a Youngkin ad attacking McAuliffe as deaf, dumb, and blind to what was going on in our schools. By the way, Glenn Youngkin, privately educated. Terry McAuliffe, privately educated. The Youngkin children, privately educated, sent to a school, by the way, that had a mask mandate, which the Republican candidate opposed. And the McAuliffe children, all but one, privately educated.
Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad. We are live at the University of Richmond's Robbins School of Business with the dynamic duo of Schapiro and Pope. Michael Pope of Virginia Public Radio, Jeff Schapiro, the veteran columnist, political columnist of the Richmond Times-Dispatch, came to Richmond in 1979. You told me on the 50th anniversary of the stock market crash, right? So very much has changed back then. I mean, you talk about, what was it? It was tobacco here and railroads and lead for gasoline, right? With Ethel Corp.
Well, you mentioned tobacco. Philip Morris, now Altria, was the largest private employer in town, approximately 15,000 employees, many of whom were very well paid. There were a goodly number of, if you will, working class multimillionaires in Richmond, folks who worked on the production line at Philip Morris
and got stock,
got a huge slice of stock. It still pays a great dividend. Now the largest private employer in the Richmond area is a credit card company. So we've gone from manufacturing essentially to services, and that transformation, by the way, is evident around the state. I mean, this was the early years of the 20th century. Agriculture was still dominant. By the middle of the 20th century, manufacturing. As we entered the 21st century, services. A lot more money made managing things, often for the federal government, than making things.
Speaking of the transformation of Virginia, Jeff Schapiro just walked us through the history of it, but I want to focus our attention on, the sort of pandemic era changes, massive changes that we've seen recently. One of the precincts I went to on election day, ever since I've lived in Alexandria, it was named after a Confederate admiral. And this election cycle was the very first time it had ever not been named for the Confederate admiral. It was named for an African-American woman who was a teacher in city schools. So they actually, because it was the name of the elementary school, they changed the name of the elementary school. It's no longer the Confederate general. It's now the African-American woman. The voter precinct, when I was checking out the precincts, it now has a new name. And so, this is the era that we're in now. All these names have changed. The statues are not on Monument Avenue here in Richmond. We've seen this massive change. And I think a lot of what we're seeing with the Republican turnout is a reaction to that. So, the fact that this voter precinct is no longer named after a Confederate admiral who I think is buried here in Matthew Fontaine Maury. I think he's actually buried in the Hollywood Cemetery.
Pathfinder of the Seas.
Pathfinder of the Seas. For a long time was the namesake of this elementary school and voter precinct in Alexandria. They've ditched Matthew Fontaine Maury, and it's now Naomi Brooks, who is this African-American woman who's a teacher. But so that is the kind of massive change that we have seen very recently. And renaming this elementary school precinct from the Confederate general to the African-American woman is not critical race theory, right? Critical race theory is a law school concept. But in the minds of a lot of voters, they would point to that and say critical race theory, which they actually, it's a reaction to anti-racism thinking and terms like white fragility that really needles a lot of people. And what we've seen out of this election is a reaction to a lot of that thinking.
I would suggest that one of the critical theories of this race is also the competition for voters' attention. Again, this is a state of 8.6 million people. There is huge competition for the interest and the attention, the eyes and the ears of voters. And, here we are in a universe in which, a basic cable package is, 800 channels. And our options now are pretty much whatever's streaming on our handheld. How do politicians pierce that static when they have seconds to do so? I would suggest that if you look at Virginia's recent political history, the messages that have broken through all that other noise tend to be very emotive, if not trivial.
In closing, in the few minutes we have left, what is Virginia telling us? Should you extrapolate from this? Again, you're going back to the dark red 1980s and the fact that Ronald Reagan was hugely popular and got chunky majorities in this state, and yet you'd swing to Democratic governors in these off-year elections and everything. Maybe it's just an idiosyncratic quirk of Virginia is just going to Virginia, and you shouldn't extrapolate too much from it, both as the GOP and the Democratic Party.
Oh, I'm sure that people are going to kind of overcalculate, overestimate overcorrect. I think the Democrats will be back. One of the reasons I think McAuliffe was selected in a heavily attended primary as the nominee is because of the dominance of really the baby boomer vote. And in Virginia, among Democrats, baby boomers are no less liberal than Gen Xers or millennials, but they are more practical, if you will. And I think that was one of the things that drove the selection of McAuliffe, again, in a heavily attended primary over a field that included 3 black candidates.
So I think one of the main takeaways is you can't win an election by going against Trump if Trump is not on the ballot, right? I think it was a strategic mistake for the McAuliffe campaign to be so focused on Trump all the time when they could have focused on raising the minimum wage or paid family medical leave and hazard pay. And they actually did have an agenda set. They didn't talk about much, but they could have. So that's one lesson. Another lesson is that you can't win statewide by just having votes out of Northern Virginia. I think you didn't see the Democrats campaigning a lot outside of Northern Virginia. They could have campaigned more statewide. You probably need all parts of the state to win statewide. And so the other lesson would be don't count out rural Virginia. Rural Virginia has a real potent political power that we're seeing in this election.
And among Republicans, they were desperate. Their backs were against the wall. They had not won statewide since 2009, and they tried every option. They tried a Trump sound-alike. They tried a Washington insider. In this case, they went with a blank slate, tabula rasa, a man who didn't have a record that could be attacked and who could self-finance.
So he is not analogous to Mitt Romney in your eyes because he's tabula rasa. He was not governor of Massachusetts, and he was not governor of a state. Didn't do the Olympic thing. Can you extrapolate him nationally, the Glenn Youngkin template, to what the future of the GOP post-Trump might be?
Well, certainly we've been seeing in the post-mortem that somehow Youngkin has established has roughed out a template under which a Republican Party still dominated by Trump thought, if not Trump himself, can repackage itself. Again, I think the Trump-Youngkin axis is important. These are people, these Trump voters, they're going to expect something from this Youngkin governor.
Correct, but does it become, again, if Trump does insert himself, and you've both deftly kind of tried to dance around the Trump thing, the specter of Trump, suppose he comes back in and wants sway and wants to primary people into 2022 and 2024, does that then charge up the 2020 vintage Democrats who came in opposition to Trump?
You know what we don't know, and Jeff Schapiro sort of touched on this earlier, is the influence of the visual. If Trump himself is standing on a stage next to Glenn Youngkin and what that would look like and the message that would send to people. We did not see that in the campaign. As you pointed out, he called into this Glenn Allen rally and then he made a direct phone call to supporters that wasn't even open to the press.
How long does that willpower last is what I'm trying to ask you.
Well, I might put this a little differently. When is Trump going to call in the chit?
Yes.
Because if Youngkin had been defeated, Trump wouldn't hesitate for a moment to say, well, he lost because he was insufficiently MAGA. Well, that he won, Trump is going to is clearly already taking credit for that. Certainly, one measure is, the robust turnout in the countryside. So this could be tricky for Glenn Youngkin. And I was a newspaper reporter. I hope it is, because it's great copy.
Close us out in the 2 minutes we have left. Predictions for 2022, to the extent anybody can look into any crystal ball right now.
I don't do predictions, but I will say 2022 is a year when we are going to see new maps. Looking ahead, I'm actually really interested in the 2022, 2023, 2024 election cycles, plural, when we've got members of the House of Delegates running year after year after year. So they're, fresh on their heels of all those 100 House members running in 2021, they will probably have to run again for a 1-year term in next year and then run again the year after that. And so, I mean, this did actually happen in the early 80s when you had a series of election cycles. There also is some interesting historical precedent that is worth looking at from the 1770s all the way up to the 1840s. Members of the House of Delegates had a term that lasted 1 year. So from 1770s all the way up to the 1840s, those elections for House of Delegates were every single year. And that's what we're headed for in the next 3 years.
Schapiro.
I made this point, and perhaps poorly at the top of the podcast. We have a different electorate in every election. Next year, congressional elections, there's a very good chance, particularly with the confusion of new boundaries, that the turnout will be significantly lower. And that may, in some areas, disproportionately magnify the voting strength of...
Did you say magnify?
Magnify. And maybe magnify the voting strength of certain slices of the electorate.
Jeff Schapiro and Michael Pope, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Full disclosure, special thanks to producer Claire Morgan at Notterly, Dean Mickey Quinones here at the Robbins School, and the indispensable Andy Miner and Courtney Ennis. Thanks as well to Roger Duvall and David Seidel of Radio IQ, WVTF, and the U of R, our host. We podcast to NPR One, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts at link fulldradio.com. You can find me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, you name it, at Full D Radio. And dare I tell you that we'll be coming to Radio IQ in the new year, God willing. I'm Robin Farzad. Thank you for listening. Back with you next week.